We'll do a review in the Sichas and Chelek Tezvav, volumes 15, the first sicha from the Parshas Vayechi. And this is partially a Rashi sicha, but also the Rebbe explains the Medrash. As you know, the Rashi addresses it, and the Medrash brings down three reasons why there is no space between the end of the Parsha of Vayigash and the beginning of the Parshas Vayechi. Usually there is a few spaces in between the Parshas, and this Parsha doesn't have a space. The Medrash brings down three reasons for it. Rashi brings down two of the reasons. The Rebbe is going to discuss that seemingly the last reason would be the most reasonable one to mention first, and the Medrash brings it third. And Rashi doesn't even mention that third reason, which would seem the most logical. And Rashi only brings the first two, and in the first two also doesn't seem like they're in the right order. It seems like the second of the two should be the first one when we approach it literally. The Rebbe is going to explain all this and show us how the Parsha Vayechi Yaakov, even though it says Yaakov lived, it's mainly the discussion about his passing, after his passing, and how the true level of life is only appreciated or recognized after the person passes on. Same thing is when a person struggles and during Golus and difficulties, and the fact that in those situations he stands still connected to Hashem, that brings about to the Vayechi, as the Rebbe will explain at length in this sicha. Let's learn inside. Vayechi, Aleph. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana. Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. So the Torah specifies how many years Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim, that it was 17 years that he lived in Mitzrayim. And then the Torah goes on to tell you the total days of Yaakov. The total number of Yaakov's life, that it was 147 years. It was the years of Yaakov's life. So the Torah singles out especially the 17 years that he lived in Mitzrayim. Frechtman, so the question is asked, Farvos darf the Torah schreiben beferish? Why does the Torah need to write specifically the Tzol Yorn was Yaakov had gelebt in Mitzrayim, the number of years that he lived in Egypt? To tell us that he lived 17 years in Egypt, we don't need the pasuk to tell us that he lived 70 years in Egypt, because we bowed station in the Friedrike Sedra, in the previous Sedra, it already says, as kumendik Mitzrayim, that when he came to Egypt and he went to meet Pare, and Pare asked him how old he is, he's given. So he responded to Pare, he said, Yemei Shnei Megurai Shloishim Ma'az Shana, that the days of my years, of the time that I was a stranger, sojourned, was 130 years. So we know that when he came to Mitzrayim, he was 130 years old. And in this pasuk, in that pasuk, the pasuk says, in this pasuk itself, when it says 17 years he lived in Mitzrayim, the pasuk concludes, that Yaakov's total years were 7 years, 40 years, and 147 years. So we know if 130 to 147 is 17, is the fun verständlich. So from this it's understood as in Mitzrayim, that in Egypt he lived for 17 years. Why is it important to distinguish and separate by themselves the years that Yaakov lived in Egypt? 70 years he was in Egypt. You can figure it out. Why does the Torah have to write that he was 17 years in Egypt? On the other hand, if the Torah wants to tell you 17 years in Egypt, the Torah doesn't have to tell you the total number of, if it was 130 plus 70, you'll figure out that it's 174. On the other hand, if for whatever reason it may be, the Torah wants to separate and talk about these years that he lived in Egypt. So this comes as a follow-up to the previous parsha, previous sedra, as it is al given kuflamet shana, that he was 130 years old. Is doch iberik l'chayre to get them samachakov for seine yorn. So it seems like it's extra to give us the total summation of his year. The cheshbon is klar from sich allein. The accounting is very clear on its own. 130 plus 17 makes 174. And either the Torah didn't have to specifically say 17 years in Egypt, or the Torah didn't have to summarize and say that it was 174 years old altogether. So the commentators answer, as the Fartel, the Torah is the Tzol Yon, that the reason why the Torah separates the amount of years was Yaakov had given to Mitzrayim, that Yaakov lived in Egypt, Uzok deroi Vayechi, and it says about it Vayechi. So it says, "Val dekuf lamet shona bis demol," because the 130 years until then, seinen bei Yaakoven nid given gerechnet v'yorn von Leben. They were not really years of life. So 100 years that he lived were not really living years. Why? Their time is, the reason is, because the days of his life were all bad. Full mit omol va'anocha. They were full with effort and sighing. He was always in trouble. At first, he had to run away of Esav. Then, sein gefinnen sich bei Lovenen. The time he spent, he found himself in the house of Lavan, was Bayoim. The pasuk says over there, Bayoim acholani chorev, that during the daytime he was eaten up by the heat. Bekerach balayla, the froze at nighttime. Batidar shnosi me'enoi, and sleep has been taken away from his eyes. He didn't sleep. So that was the time that he spent by Lavan. Bis to Mechiras Yosef. Till then he was sold. That Yaakov was mourning for Yosef all these years that he was away. So his life basically was a life full with troubles and with sighing. But when he came to Egypt, so he didn't suffer any troubles. On the contrary, he lived a life of peace and relaxation. While he was sitting in the best of the land. So it was quite zendik as alle seine Kinder, seine Gans. He was witnessing, seeing that all of his children are whole. And Yosef, als Mishnah of the Melech, and Yosef, he was the second to the king. So he said that everybody is doing well. So the father is that's why then it was Yaakov lived. So this is like a special category in itself. He lived 17 years. The rest wasn't really life. So why does the Torah sum up later on and saying his total life was 147 years? To tell you that these good years compensated sort of though now that everything was really good. When the Torah is koilel alle seine Jahren zusammen, the Torah includes all of his years together in a sachakov of the Kufim Zayin Shana in the total of the 147 years. Why does the Torah do that? The Torah wants to point out with this as the letzte 17 gute Jahr, that these latest 17 good years, the Vayechi Jahr, the year that he lived, gemacht vergessen dem Tsar. They made him forget the pain, und agmas nefesh, and the heartache, von der alle friedliche Jahren sein, from all of his previous years. Bis sie haben alle ausgesehen wie gute Jahre. They all appeared like they were all good years. Kulam shavim l'toiva, they were all equally good. So the Torah goes back that first he lived good years, 17 years. And then all of his life was 74. They sort of compensated for that. The Rebbe still does not satisfied. Here we're telling you this number that they really compensated for everything. How could that possibly be that the 17 perfect years that Yaakov experienced in Mitzrayim actually compensated, and they are all considered good, even the previous years when this was two extremes. Over there it was full with troubles, and here it was perfect, the best. Let's see inside. This is aber noch als nit glatik. This is still not smooth. Let it be true. As Vibaldi lets the Yoren Zayne given betoiva, since the later year were good. They have compensated so much for Yaakov. Bis zu machen and vergessen die Yisunim von alle friedliche Jahren to the extent that it made him forget all of his pain from the previous years. But how could you come up to such a summation, a total? What's his badvus? We know that it's 147. And we're saying to you, especially that number, to tell you, to emphasize. Now we're telling you, only to emphasize that it's 100, but they're all good. The only purpose of it is to tell you they were all equal. That they're all equal for the good. That's the reason that we are writing this second part of the parasha. So that's hard to accept, because 130 years, 130 years were few and bad, which is opposite of good. And the 17 years, Vayechi, and the 70 years of Vayechi, the ultimate life and good. And here we're saying the Torah says, no, they're all good. And so that means to write it specially for the Torah to tell you that they're all good means that it's really to the fullest extent. But how could we say that? Wird man das verstehen durch Mevair sein Divrei HaMedrash. So the Rebbe said we'll understand the base. Wird das verstehen by explaining the words of the Medrash und Pirush Rashi in only von unser Sedra in the beginning of our Sedra. The Medrash says, Lama Parsha Zu Stuma Mikol HaParshiyos Shel Torah. Why is this portion closed? Different than all other portions of the Torah? Hello, the answer is rather. Gives three answers. First of all, Kivon Sheniftar Avinu Yaakov. Once our father Yaakov dies, which is related later on in the Seder, Hischilo Shibud Mitzrayim al Yisrael, the slavery of the Egyptians on the Jewish people began with Yaakov's passing. So it sort of closed up the Jewish people into their exile into Mitzrayim. Rashi gives the Medrash gives another interpretation. Lamahu stuma. Why is it closed? Yaakov seeked, he wanted to reveal the end of the Golus, and it was closed from him. And this is also when Yaakov later on in the Parsha is calling all of his sons together, and he said to them, he wanted to tell them the end of the day, he wanted to tell them the Kates, and then he didn't tell them, he started telling other things, and it was closed. That's another reason why the Parsha over here is closed, because of what Yaakov wanted to tell his sons, and he couldn't tell them. It was closed, so that's why that Parsha is closed. A third interpretation the Medrash brings, Tavarachar, Lama Histuma. Why is this closed? So it says, because Hashem closed for Yaakov all troubles of the world, the Vayechi that we said before. At this point in time in his life, Hashem closed off all negative, all problems, anything in the world, all difficulties, and now it was closed. Now he started the Vayechi. So Rabbi says, okay, we understand. The question is very understood. Every parsha has a break in between the parshas, but our parsha doesn't have, so we need to understand that. But it would seem that the break should be telling us about Vayechi, because the break takes place right before Vayechi. So we should say that the break was in all the troubles and it began Vayechi. The kasha, Lama Pasha Zustuma, main the pashtas, what does it mean? The question that the Medrash asked, why is this portion closed? Main the Pshuta Shal Mikra, in the simple, literal level of the pasuk, Tozvas is nitok in Rebach. This, there is no space, far diverter Vayechi Yaakov, before the words of Vayechi Yaakov. Why is there no space? Since we're starting a new Sedra, is verstandig. It's understood as though that in this Sedra, we buy alle andere Sedras from the Torah, just like by all other portions of the Torah. There should be an interruption, be some space before the starting of the Parsha of Vayechi Yaakov. That's the question. So the answer is, what should be the answer to this question? That there is no space because something ended over here. So Apiya now, based on this question, we'll explain is not verstanden. It's not understood over here. I was going to ask, why does the Medrash give us the first two interpretation versus the third one it gives us last? The stima far diverter Vayechi Yaakov, the closing of the parsha that comes before the words Vayechi Yaakov, hat lechoyre zum allem ersten. So first of all, it should have, would seem, gedarft ondeiten auf as stima lemal yusa. This should have pointed to a closing that is advantageous, something good. Was Vayechi Yaakov had Goyim given. Yaakov caused that all the troubles were finished and now he's living. The Hainu. That would be those was demult. The fact that Hashem closed all troubles of the world before him. So that should be the first answer. Noch starker is the Shaila. It's even more the question is stronger, because even before this closing, before the words of Vayechi, there's siyum from Parshas Vayigash in the end of the portion of Vayigash. There zählt wegen dem guten Matze Vachaim from Bnei Yisrael in Eretz Goshen, about the good standing of life, the way they experienced the Bnei Yisrael in the land of Goshen. As is given in an Oifen, it was in a way from Vayifru Vayirbu Memoid. They multiplied, they were fruitful, and they multiplied very much. Is b'shas as gleich noch dem. So the time that immediately after the nice situation that the Yidden were in Mitzrayim, in Parshas Vayigash, immediately following Onshum Hefsek without interruption, their tzel their posuk Vayechi Yaakov Beretz Mitzrayim Goimer, that he lived in Mitzrayim, is doch the Svara Mechayiv. So logic dictates, as mit der Stimme meint the Torah zu matkish sein, that with this close up, the Torah means to emphasize as Vayechi Yaakov kum bismichas, that the living of Yaakov comes close. On kein hefsek in sein Teuchen, there is no interruption in the contents, hatoiv, in the good content, we can see him from the Friedike Parsha, with the conclusion of the previous Parsha. So we're going straight from the good that was related in the Parsha, end of Parshas Vayigash, to continue Vayechi. Is farvos kum der tam from sosim imenu kol tzorah sheba'olam. So why does the reason that he closed all troubles the olam in Medrash als lesser from the timing? It comes as the last of the reasons. When the erst, das heißt ikadike timing, it probably has to be an ayin here. Erste, das heißt ikadike timing. Euch stimas haparsha, Should be a fair here. Okay. Time öftim Rashi seinen Gor in Yonim was einen Lehepech from Vayifru Goimer Vayechi Yaakov Beres Mitzrayim. So the first and the main reason why the portion does not have any spaces is Sosum are talking about aspects, matters which are just the opposite, that they multiplied and the Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim. They're talking about Golus, they're talking about the Shibud afterwards, Nistam decays, doesn't fit. That's as far as the order of these three answers in the Medrash, but Rashi doesn't even bring down the third answer altogether. Nochmer is schwer in Pirush Rashi ala Torah. Even more is difficult in the Rashi's commentary in the Torah. The Bald as Darke Shel Rashi is Darke Lefarei Pshuta Shel Mikra. Rashi explains the simple meaning of the pasuk. And so Rashi should have seemingly accepted als Iker dem Tam Hastima by Vayechi Yaakov. The main, what would be the reason why the Torah closed it up, no space, by Vayechi Yaakov, was Diriktoisan Inyan Toiv, that expressed something good in Shaykhs to Vayifru Goimer, which is the end of the Parsha of Yigra. They multiplied, they were fruitful. So Rashi should have said something positive over here. Kinal, as mentioned earlier. And not to something which is opposite of good. That happened through his passing. So the pasuk talks about Nistamu, a name the Yidden were suffering from the Shibud after his passing. That tells us what happened after Yaakov's passing. That happened through his passing, and that's when the Jews became enslaved to Paroi. But this is opposite of Vayechi Yaakov. So why the Vayechi Yaakov, which is right next to between the Vayifru and Vayechi Yaakov, Rashi says something negative when it's seemingly we should interpret it first in the positive. Is it move? Aleph. So first of all, Dafke od dem dritten tam in Medrash. It is specifically this third reason in the Medrash. Shesosam imenu kol tzorah zechulu, that he has closed from him all troubles, that Yaakov didn't experience more trouble, v'chulu, which is amnensun to pashtus hamikra. This is closest to the simple of the pasuk. Bring it Rashi. Rashi doesn't even bring that down at all. Base. The zwei timing from Medrash was Rashi bringt, yeah. Also, these two reasons of the Medrash which Rashi does bring, but there's a lechayre gedaf stellen auf harkerten say that he seemingly should have placed them in the opposite order. Leuten zweiten tam, according to this second reason, at least the closing is stima verbund with Yaakov. It's still connected with you when Yaakov is alive. Yes, Yaakov was trying to tell his kids what's going to happen because he's coming close to passing. So he's trying to tell them, but notwithstanding, he's close to passing, but it's still during his lifetime. Hagamas the sibetz Yaakov's rotzen to megala zayin dem ketz. The reason why Yaakov wished to reveal the end is given the fact that this was close to his passing. This is but yet it took place during his lifetime. So at least the second reason that Rashi brings was happened during his lifetime. But when we talk about the first reason, that the troubles of the Yidden began after Yaakov's passing, that talks about after Yaakov's passing. And the Rebbe adds to it, the negativity also it's greater, is the Nochmer Harb is greater, that the Yidden are in Shibud and everything else. Which is, he wanted to tell the kids and it was hidden from him. It's not as serious as the first reason. So why does Rashi skip the third reason and also in the order brings it in the order the way Rashi does? Gimel. So the Rebbe explains B'chlal, according to these two reasons that Rashi brings down, the Mefarshim ask, why was the Sosum, the Parsha in the beginning between Vayigash and Vayechi, they're closed. It should be closed by when Yaakov is trying to tell his sons, couldn't tell them, oh, there should be closed. Or why, or maybe it should be closed. According to the other reason, after Yaakov's death, when this story, there should be something closed. How is the closed in the beginning of the Parsha Vayechi and Vayigash point to this ideas that are later on in the Parsha, not in the beginning of the Parsha? The Farshim explain that the only place where you can tell if something is closed or not is the beginning of the Parsha. And the Parsha, because in the middle there's not supposed to be any space. Over here there's supposed to be space, and we don't make the space, that tells us that it's closed. And because it's the whole Parsha, so in the beginning of the Parsha is really part of the whole Parsha. This is explained. Bet das verstehen, Gimel. Bet das verstehen, like that was Mefarshim for entering the Karsha of the Tzvei Taimim. Mefarshim answer, there's a question on both of these reasons. If the reason why the Parsha is closed is because once Yaakov Avinu passed away, the Yidden became in trouble with Mitzrayim and they slavery. Other according to the that he wanted to reveal the end of day, and it was Nistam Imenu, Lebano v'Nistam Chulu, hat doch die Stimme gedarf sein später in die Psukim, wo es wegen Stimme Saketz, oder wegen Tiris Yaakov. So this closer needs to be later on in the verses in which it discusses that the gates was closed by when he says, when he gathered his sons to tell them when the end is going to be, over there, they should be closed. Or the Vegem Petiris Yaakov, according to the other one, when Yaakov dies over there, should say that the Shibud started over there, should be closed over there. If I answered, and the answer, as a stima in mitten Seder is not kentig. If you close in the middle of the Seder, it's not, you can't tell. Like in Onev Seder, as opposed to in the beginning of the Seder. Now here, there's a whole discussion exactly because, whether Vayechi and is it really closed because there's the other schedule in which they read the Torah of 3.5 years. The whole big discussion, the horrors over here. But the Rebbe says the child who's learning Pshut Shemikra, he learns the way we do it. We do it on Simchas Torah. We finish the Torah once a year. So Vayechi is a parsha, and therefore the whole discussion is mute when it comes to the Pshut Shemikra. All right. Shas the stima is an unhabes sedra. So what do they say? How can you tell? So it says, okay, so you can only say the beginning. But how does it relate to what happens in this sedra? Shaz the stima is an unhabes sedra. When the closer is in the beginning of the sedra. Vos mitanayer sedra hebt sich on a new sedra begins a new subject. Dav zayin a hefsek revach, then you need to have some space. More than the usual space. That's why between each Seder, because Seder is supposed to be a new subject matter, so therefore it has to have some more space. So when it's totally no space and it's closed, and since these subject matters are in two separate Seders, is mistaber loymar, so then it makes sense to say as this stima that this clothing does not this clothing does not point to clothing for specific verses and words with the stima gefinzach where the closer is. We have to make a closure for something in the parsha, but it doesn't mean in that specific only to those details. But rather it's connected with the general contents of the Seder. Und der Fahr wird sie nirmals mit der Agdoma zu der Teuchen HaSedra and therefore it is hinted as an introduction to the contents of the Sedra, as the Rebbe will explain. as the Rikir Teuchen from the Sedra Vayechi, since the main contents of the portion of Vayechi is Sedra Vayechi, is Vegamu Rois, Vazainen Nit, Sheiches zu Oifen Achaim from Yaakov Avinu in Eretz Mitzrayim. It's about happenings that are not related. What does the parsha talk about? It doesn't talk about how Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt. Those were the Tzeltim Parsha Vayigash. That is related to the portion of Vayigash. As Yaakov, one of them, given in Meitav Oretz, they had no best of the land, that till the end of the Parsha Vayigash, they fruitful and they multiplied very much. So Yaakov's life in Mitzrayim itself is not discussed in the Parsha of Vayechi, but rather in Parsha Vayigash. What does the Parsha Vayechi talk about? Those are happenings as it relates to his passing, till his actual passing. The days of Israel came close to die. In Onefai Parsha, that's the beginning of the Parsha. And then the continuous matters that they discussed, like Yaakov Avinu's brachas to Yosef Lebanov, Yaakov, our father's blessing to Yosef his son, the noch the bracha Lebanov, and then the blessing to his son. In Yonim was ein shaykh zum man shekoid maptira. Those are matters that connect to the time that is before his passing. Okay. These are all the discussions of this parsha. Ubefrat, so we have to connect it to something. The stimus has to do with what the discussion of the parsha is, which is the passing of Yaakov. And the Rebbe says, especially right in the first pasuk, we already sum up his life. Befrat as Balbechizah pasuk, I said right in the beginning, in the Mershtum pasuk, in the first pasuk, now we're telling you from Kol Shnei Chai Yaakov. We already say all of Yaakov's life. So in other words, we're moving on from his life. That's what the idea of the parsha is the fun verstandig. So from this we understand, as with the parsha stuma made the Torah undight, that when the Torah has a parsha stuma, the Torah means to point of astima bekesher to them teuchen klol from the parsha. This is a stima as it relates to the general theme, general idea, contents of the parsha, which is Petiras Yaakov, Therefore, we don't need the stima to be next to those specific verses, but we need the stima to be in the general idea as it relates to the passing of Yaakov. Damit werden verantwortet beide über the Monte Kashis. With this, the both above mentioned questions that the Meforshim, the way they explain that it's all about what the contents of the parsha is, Stuma. So this answers the both above questions. But Rashi is mashmid dem dritten tam. Why Rashi does not bring down the third time? He only the third reason of the Medrash. Und then we say there from the zwei gebrachte time in the order of the two mentioned reasons. This stima is verbunden mit Petiras Yaakov, since this clothing is connected with the passing of Yaakov, und mit die Passierungen in Sheiches mit der Petira, and with the happenings as they relate with the passing. So in the simple meaning of the pasuk, there is no real room as the stima from der Sedre was read wegen Petiras Yaakov, that the Sedra talks about Yaakov's passing on the time when all the tzoros have completed, because we're not talking about his lifetime, we're talking about his passing. Sayin's man shesosim imenu, because also in time that all the troubles have been is given bald by Kum Mitzrayim. That took place as soon as he came to Egypt. That was 70 years prior to his passing. Sayin Toicher, and also in contents that inyan fun shesosa mimenu kol tzoros sheba'ilam, this idea that closed all the troubles of the world, was his tachlis as chayis, which is the ultimate life, is in kegenzatz to inyan haptir shel Yaakov. That is diametrically opposed, opposite. It's the extreme opposite of Yaakov's passing. We're talking about the best of his life versus passing. So since the parsha talks about passing, can't relate it to his goodness of his life. Therefore, is Rashi ganzem mashmit the written tam. That's why Rashi totally leaves out the third reason. But Tamze is euch kashenish, and for that same reason, it's also not difficult. The order of Rashi was shebikash legalis, that he wanted to reveal shtel to Rashi al zweiten tam, that this is the second reason. While in shayches zu petiras Yaakov, because when we are trying to connect it to Yaakov's passing, is the tam sheniftar chulu, the reason that when he died, that is more netet subshuta shemikra. That's closer to the simple meaning of the pasuk. Vibaldi petira gufa, because over there it's the passing is given the siba to their stima. That was why it was closed, because he passed away. That's why the Yidden's Sores began, had directly connected to his passing, as opposed to the reason that Rashi brings second, but that wouldn't be the first one. So basically, the Rebbe's answer is that we're actually trying to explain, or trying to find an association, not to the Vayechi, we're trying to find an association to his passing. And as association to his passing, the third reason doesn't fit in at all. And the second reason is less. And the first reason, which is directly related to the passing of Yaakov, which is the theme of this parsha, that Rashi brings as the first reason. However, the Rebbe still remains with the question, why is the parsha called Vayechi then, if it's all about his passing? So why do we call it Vayechi? Es bleibt aber noch nicht verstandig, it's still not understood the inner meaning of things. Farvos hebt sich Taka on the Sedre mit Vayechi Yaakov. Why does Taka the parsha begin? Yaakov lived. The ganze Sedre redt sich wegen der Petire von Yaakov. The whole entire portion talks about Yaakov's passing. Und die Passierungen in Shayches mit ihr, and the stories that happen that relates with the passing. Heinem es ad der Sachakov von Shnei Chayi Yaakov kommt in Verbindung mit seinem Petire. So when the pasuk says the years of Yaakov, that is already relates to his passing. We're saying all of his years that he lived. So we are talking about his passing, wie gesagt, Freya said before. So that only explains the second part of the pasuk. By Yaakov's life was 147 years. That means that he's passing after this, but all of his days of his life. So we're talking about his passing. However, but the fact still remains that the first part of the pasuk talks about the Vayechi Yaakov. So why does the parsha should have almost Vayechi Yaakov Beretz Mitzrayim Shvas Rishona should have been almost the last words in the parsha's Vayigash, and our parsha should have started with Vayu Yumei Yaakov, that it was the summation of his days of his years. So why does it have Yaakov? The ganze said that it's wegen der Petire von Yaakov, since the entire portion talks about Yaakov's passing. Und die Passierung in the Shayches, what happened there? Hey, Nemes, let it be true as der Sachakel von Shnei Chayi Yaakov kommt in Verbindung mit seinem Petire. When the Torah gives you the total month is connected to his passing, wie gesagt, for I said before, der Mirt wird aber bloß recht die Shayches von zweiten Abend Pasuk. This only explains the connection with the second half of the verse. Vayu Yumei Yaakov, that his days of his year was 100. That's talking about the passing. Oh, but the first half of the pasuk, that he lived in Mitzrayim 17 years, was very detailed. Over there, the Torah tells us that Yaakov's best year, about the best years of Yaakov. What is that connection to Yaakov's passing? According to this, the dividing of the sentence should have been this first part of the pasuk does so the Gedarv Zayin der Siyum from Parshas Vayigash. This needed to be the end of the portion of Vayigash. that Yaakov came alive when he heard that Yosef is alive. Und Vayechi Yisrael, and he said, "Vayifru vayirbu moed," and they settled. They were fruitful. Und Vahi Yaakov, and he lived 70 years. And then Parshas Vayechi should have started with Vahi Yaakov, the Aschola from Parshas Vayechi. But I was going to explain now that actually the real best years of the Vayechi is actually said by after his life and by his passing, as Rebbe will explain in the next Isvav. The beer in them, Amitis Inyan HaChaim, the true concept of life is Azachayim versus Alam al Chai. That's a life that always is alive. Hotakim Nitzch on Shinuyim. It has a eternal existence, doesn't change. Was the far is the emes metzias von Chaim. That's why the true existence of life, faran nor by Meibishter, this is only by Hashem. The Remokar Chaim, the source of life, the state, as the pasuk states, Vayechi emes hu lekim Chaim. Hashem, the true God, is the true life. Was emes is azach was vert nit nifsak. Emes is something which never stops, nishtan, it doesn't change. In them is the ahefsek. If, however, in it there is an interruption, vetus angerufen kozov, then it's called false. Was the fargefindment, that's what we find. As teichen was werden ausgetrickend. Those rivers that are dried, einmal in 7 years, once in 7 years, werden sie angerufen, they are referred to as nahore samachazvin. The lying rivers, they're not true rivers because they dry out, even though it's only once in 7 years. They're called Norasim Chazim, and they will not be fit as an apostle. They're disqualified Likiddush Mei Chatos. When you need to sanctify the Chatos water, when you bring the Parah Aduma, you have to bring it from Mayim Chaim. But they're not fit, even though they only dry out, even while they're existing. They're not living waters. Und der Fall sagen Chazal, and that's why our sage of blessed memory tell us, as Chisomesh LaKadosh Baruch Emes, Hashem's seal is the letter Am Aleph Mem Sof. Why Aleph Mem Sof? This is the beginning, the middle, and the end shows that there's no difference, that it's consistent all through the Aleph. But Emes is zuneivgestellt von drei Oisies. Emes is put together from the three letters, Aleph, which is the erster ois von Aleph base, that's the first letter of the Aleph base. Mem, the mittelster ois, that's the middle letter, and Tov, their letzter ois, the last letter of the Aleph base. Was beweist as it is unkenish that Hashem is true, doesn't change. As the verse says, and the Rishon, I'm in the beginning, Vani Achreim, I'm in the end, and without me there is no God. Thus mean their posik, Vavai Elikim emes. Hashem Elikim is true. About Mehusa Yisbarach is emes, because his essence, his blessed essence is truth, which means was vert came only nifsak on ishtanach as v'shalom, never interrupted and never changes, God forbid. Is hu Elikim Chaim, that's what makes him Elikim Chaim. Und is Yisbarach the emes and metzias v'chaim, so he blessed is the true existence of Chaim. As opposed to created being, they are not a true existence in themselves, created being independently by themselves, without their connection to Hashem, and Hashem is them as independent by themselves, they are not a true existence. So they came into being, and in essence they are present, and then again they're lost, they're just temporary. Therefore, and of themselves, there's no true life. When the Nivra is only in a case that the created being is connected and tied with godness. And that's why Yidden are called Chaim, because their cleaving their connection to godliness. Because you're connected to Hashem, your God, that's where your life today. As they are also alive and existent forever, in essence existent because of their connection. Since the Eibishter is always there, connected to Hashem, they're always also always. But in order for this true life, the dveikus belakus, which is through the connection, your connection to godliness, but Jews should be recognized, you should be able to see it in this physical world, which in essence that blocks, it obscures the truth from godly matters. He says, Dafke durch them, it says only specifically through this, was gate durch the nisyonis bilbulim, that he goes through these tests and the confusions, again, and all the disturbances in sein Dveikus, in his connection, und doch bleibt ganz, and still he remains whole. Und umgekehrt, he doesn't change in Kima Ter Mitzvahs, in the Bezuren Ter Mitzvahs. Then it is revealed with fully clearly as an emer serchayis, his true life, because his connection to God cannot be changed, and that means that he's really alive because he always, and notwithstanding all the obstacles, he stays there. Zion, like them is verstandig the shaykhs from Vayechi to the close hasedim. Like this, with this we understand the connection of Yaakov's life, Yaakov, to the general theme of the parsha. The main theme is Yaakov's passing. Und euch der Tam was the ganze seder of Vayechi. That's the reason why we call it all Vayechi. The Meshach, the Aleph, during the duration of all the previous years. Hat man nicht gesehen sicher. You did not see for sure. Haven't seen for sure. See ze seine Jordan von Emerson Vayechi, whether they're really lives of the real Vayechi. The real life means a life when you're connected to God, your God, and you're alive again. Especially when we're talking about such a cleaving and unchaim and such life, which fits the level of the fathers, which they are like they're the chariot. But in the cloud when we say don't believe in yourself until the day that you die, that rule applies to everybody, even to the others. This is written also with regard to tzaddikim. Especially that Yaakov, our father, specifically, he was worried. Maybe sin would cause. Und der Vater ist ein Darge von Dveikes b'meshech von alle Jahren in euch in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, his level of connection to Hashem during the duration of all the years, even in Eretz Yisrael, und das durchgehen sehr viel Tzoris und Yisurim, and the fact that he had to go through so much trouble and so much pain. This was still not a sufficient proof of his Emerson Vayechi, of his true life. Even not this that he saw, as euch seine Kinder und Bnei Bonim seine Tzadikim, that also his children and his grandchildren are Tzadikim. Bald sie haben sich gefunden in Eretz Yisrael, since they were in Eretz Yisrael, we don't know how their standing would be when you are in a gross land and an environment like Mitzrayim. Shas Ober Yaakov. But the Greek then Zman from Samuch Lipitiros, when Yaakov reached the time close to his passing. Befrat as intuition is given their coming in Mitzrayim, especially in the meantime he came to Mitzrayim. And then he was convinced himself that even while he lived in the promiscuity of the land, in the lowest places of the land, he's still in the highest level of wholesomeness. Until the last moment of his life. Especially when he saw there as that his bad is hold on all of his children. As alle Kind, seine Kinder, seine ganze Zedek that all his children are wholesome in their righteousness. Yosef, also Yosef, notwithstanding the fact that he's a king. He was captured amongst the Goyim. He also was standing in his righteousness. To the extent that also Menashe and Ephraim was born in Mitzrayim, who were born in Mitzrayim, Ervas Oretz, the nakedness of the land, the lowest place of the lands, and the Roy Bracha, and they too are fit to the Bracha. Not so just a plain Bracha. Unafazoy feel as in Mechol HaToros that even in all Mechol HaToros, all generation, will sich Menschen mit Zeh will be blessed with them. Yisimcha lekim k'Ephraim v'chem Menashe. May God make you like Ephraim and Menashe. So this is a tremendous level of Bracha. Das erst that Megala given Yaakov's emes and chayes. This revealed Yaakov's true life. As Oich al seine friedliche Jahren, also his previous years. Hagam bechitzoin is full mit Yisun menagmas nefesh. Although externally they were full with pain and heartache, seine bepnimi is given in inner they were Vayechi Yaakov. He really lived on the far side the letzten 17 Jahr in Mitzrayim, and that's why the last 17 years in Egypt. A klorer bavais as kulam shavim l'tova. They showed that they're all equal for the good. That his connection, his vayechi, was always, and it only comes out when we come close to the time when it comes to in Eretz Mitzrayim. That's when we get the vayechi. Ches the mit is move on. But this we understand was the sedre and angerufen vayechi. Gam, why we understand why we call it Vayechi and he lived. Gam as in Retzich nit nor wegen the mirois for Yaakov Samach Pterosei. Although we're not only talking about those happenings that was with Yaakov close to his passing, Naroich Pteres Yaakov, also about Yaakov's passing, wegen dem Zman was noch them, and about the time that follows, we still call it all Vayechi. The Gemara is as Yaakov Avinu loy meis. Yaakov Avinu didn't die. Just like his seed is alive, so he's alive. When the Shvar state is by Yaakov, the Loshem Misa, that's why Yaakov, it doesn't say in the pasuk that he died. It says Vayigva, doesn't say that. Because the Pirush Darfun is, what does it mean? That Emes Chaim for Yaakov by stating them, the main, the real, the true life of Yaakov consists in the fact that his children are alive. This haste, it means the Yois. Since as the Emes said Inyan, that the real matter from Chaim is is nitzchadik unkim lad, that it is eternal and it stays forever. Al derech v'dos is kaviyochel by the Eibush in the Mokar Chaim, just as it is, so to speak, by Hashem, the source of life, that it's eternal. It's always tzvem in Zayin to which Yidden are connected. The Riber zetzich on the Emes Chaim for Yaakov. Therefore, when can we tell the true life of Yaakov? Davkevem and Zed, the Nitzchi is the Kaider from when we see the eternity of this. Oich noch dem in the neshama geht weg from guf. Also, when the soul departs from the body. This means as nit nor der Chayes udvekes bleibt nitzchadik in Chayes and neshama, so that the energy and the connection remains eternal with the soul in the life of the soul. But also below in this world, like the Emes Chaim from Yaakov, the true life of Yaakov remains. His kinder and his children, as they leben them Emes Chaim from Yaakov. They live the true life of Yaakov. That is his true life when it goes in the gashmis, the physical life in his children. Them is not gishmak in their time. According to this, it's even more sweeter. The reasoning was the Sreder Ventaguru from Vayechi, why this portion is called Vayechi. Their meat is niblois mudgash. With this, it's not only emphasized as Oichel Achre B'Tiris Yaakov, that even after Yaakov is noch outside to say Vayechi Yaakov, we can still say Vayechi Yaakov. No noch mer. It's not only that, we can also say Dafka Demel. It's only then Achre B'Tirosei. After his passing, his Ershkenting, then it's recognizable that Emes and Nitzchas Dikar Vayechi Yaakov, the true eternal Yaakov's life. Tess. Het früher gerät, As mitzad dem was the Stimus Aparshe is verbunden, nicht mit dem Wörter Vayechi Yaakov, that the Parsha's closing is not tied to the words Yaakov's life, nor mit der Hascholos HaSedra, but it's the beginning of the Seder, the whole subject matter. So it's not the verse itself. Was Teuchen is Ptiris Yaakov, the contents, theme is Yaakov's passing. And the Yonah was and the things that are connected. Is Rashi mash mit dem dritten Tam from Medrash. And Rashi leaves out the third reason of the Medrash. That he closed from Yaakov all troubles of the world. That interpretation in the closure, that there is no space, Rashi leaves out. Rashi just brings the two reasons. Sheniftar Yaakov, that Yaakov died, and the tzaras began. That he sought to reveal the end to his sons, and that has been blocked from him. That are related to Birish Yaakov. Now it is even more sweeter, understandable. This also fits in the inner meaning of the thing, that Yaakov's life is recognizable through the content, through the theme of the Parsha. That specifically this portion, Yaakov's passing, is called the Vayechi. Was Davke, because specifically to these two commentaries, that these bring out and it emphasizes that the true life extended to his sons. We don't want to talk about what Yaakov's level itself, because the Rebbe explained that it's when it comes to the son. So this two interpretations bring out that concept. Isaiah Emerson level Begolu is given that that in his son's life openly was also the idea of observance of Torah mitzvahs, dveikis in Elokus, to connect to godness. Those was Eden lernen Torah and Mekai mitzvahs in that side messages they talk in Shibud V'Golus. The fact that Jews study Torah and they observe mitzvahs in a time when there is no slavery, there's no exile, is as nit kein großer Chiddush. That's no big deal. It's not a big novelty. Nochmer, even more. Even when Yidden observe Torah mitzvahs when they are in exile. But the matzah from Golus is azah. But the situation in Golus is such as we feel the Giludim Ketz, you can sense, there's an end. The Gula. The Veis Bahasoga, the case understand intellectually in your mind the end on Ois Golus. And that there's no more exile. Being redeemed and out of Golus. Then it does not express in itself the wholesome idea of Vayechi from Eden, the real life of Eden. But when the slavery and the trouble of the exile are so big, as to the extent that with the human intellect, you don't even see how are we going to be redeemed. Nistam HaKeitz, I mean, the Keitz is closed, we don't see. And still you believe with complete faith as the Geula vet kumen, that the Geula is going to come to the extent I wait for him every day that he's going to come. And in the difficulties, the boundaries, the limitation, and the pains of the exile, we're learning Torah. And you observe mitzvah. Here we openly revealed as Torah mitzvahs is the emissar chayes, that the Torah and the mitzvahs is the true life of the Yid. And therefore, is verstandig, it's understood. As davke durch dem drückt sich ois der emissar chayes von Yaakov, that it's specifically through this that the true energy of Yaakov is revealed. He is alive. because his children are alive. Vayechi Yaakov. Damit wird noch besser verstandig, was Rashi bringt, bloß die erste zwei Timer. This gives us more understanding why Rashi brings the first reason. We need them time for Shesosim Meno called that he closed all the troubles with. Because when you do mitzvahs in the time when you don't have any troubles, that doesn't prove that there is no a vitality without change. When is the true life revealed? In the Avodim, the Zman from Tzoros HaShibuz, when you serve Hashem in the time when there's trouble of slavery. And there's no kates. When der Vayechi von Teure Mitzvahs tut sich auf, euch ins Mann von Golden Shibus. And then when the Vayechi of Teure Mitzvahs, that life accomplished also in the time when you're in exile and Shibut, werden is Gala de Kavone Pnimis from their Tachlis from the Golus and Tzoros HaShibus. Then is revealed the inner intent, the goal, and the purpose of the Golus and the troubles of the Shibus. Adavke durch dem kommt man zu the Giluyim, that it's only through that you reach the revelations from the Geula B'Tachlis HaShleimus to the redemption in its total and wholesome completeness. Yud, damit wird euch verstandig der Pnimis Zikir Tam. Now we also understand the inner reason for was is Nista Mimenu HaKetz, why the Ketz has been closed and blocked from Yaakov. Well, the case is Gala geworden, if the case would have been revealed, well, that would get felt in the Inyan for Tekev HaGolos, then they would be lacking in the force of the Golos. Also in the wholesomeness of the redemption that comes through the Golos, because it wouldn't be a full Golos. Rashi says, "Shebikesh the Galus is Haketz, Levonov and Istam Emenu." Rashi brings down first that he wanted to tell them the case, and then it was covered. But Rashi could have just said he couldn't tell them the case without telling that he wanted to. The Rashi kommt doch mevayer sein tam from them was Parshas Ustuma. Rashi is coming to explain why is this portion closed, but doch gewen genug. It would have been sufficient as well sagen, shenistam Emenu case. The case was closed. Was it on gate to the Tzelum? As Bikesh Legalis is a case, why does we have to tell us that he wanted to reveal the case? But in them is merumas, but it's hinted as Adrabe, Davke durch Nista Mimenu, that specifically through that fact that it was hidden from him, hat sich ausgeführt sein Bakoshe Legalis is a case Lebonov. That's how his request to reveal the case Lebonov actually was accomplished. The stimus haketz is nitkin helem tzulim helem chaz v'sholom. Not revealing the end, blocking the end is not a block just to block, God forbid. No, tachlis is the goal is that through it later will come out the gilui haketz, the revelation that the canal is mentioned earlier. Thus main bikesh legalis haketz lebonov v'nistam mimenu. He wanted to reveal the case of his son, and it was hidden from him. B'shas Yaakov had gewollt mamshich zayin. Umegal zayin lebon of the Geula. Because Yaakov wants to do that, to give them the Geula, is b'chdei as bonov zoln dos hom b'shleimus, so that they should have it in the greatest level. Is given stimas haketz, was the closing of the case. Dos is given dachone, and this is the preparation as the noch zoln ze mekabel zayin, that later on they should receive those was bikesh Yaakov legalis. Then they could actually receive but Yaakov, that Geula that he wants to tell them, the Giluyim for the Geula Hasida, the revelation of the future redemption. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Vayechi Tovshin Chof Hei.